Hello and welcome to the Agile Innovation Leaders Podcast. I'm Ola Ojako. On this podcast, I speak with world-class leaders and doers about themselves and a variety of topics spanning agile, lean innovation, business, leadership, and much more, with actionable takeaways for you, the listener. So I have with me here Luke Hohmann, who is a fourth-time author, three-time founder, serial entrepreneur, if I may say, a SAFE fellow, so that's a Scaled Agile framework fellow, keynote speaker, and an internationally recognized expert in agile software development. He is also a proud husband and a father of four. So Luke, I am very honored to have you on the Agile Innovation Leaders Podcast. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. And hi, everyone who's listening.
Yes, I'm sure they're waving back at you as well. I always start my conversations with my guests to find out about them as individuals, So who is Luke? You have a BSc in computer science, an MSc in computer science and engineering, but you also studied cognitive psychology and organizational behavior in addition to data structures and artificial intelligence. I mean, AI is now making waves and is kind of at the forefront, which is interesting. You had the foresight to also look into these. So my question is, what took you down this path?
Sure. I had a humble beginning in the world of technology. I worked for a large company, Electronic Data Systems, and it was founded in the late 60s, mid 60s by a gentleman named Ross Perot, and it became a very, very large company. So my first job at Electronic Data Systems was working in a data center. And we know what data centers are, but back then data centers were different because they were predominantly mainframe-based data centers. And I would crawl underneath the floor, cabling the computers and cabling networking equipment. Now, when we think networking, we're really thinking one of two kinds of networking. We think of wireless networking, or we think of some form of internet networking. But back in those days, there were varieties of network protocols. Literally the standards that we use now weren't invented yet. So it was mainframe networking protocols and dial-ups and other forms of networking protocols. From there, I worked my way from beneath the ground up. I had some great managers who saw someone who was worthy of opportunity, and they gave me opportunity, and it was great. And then eventually, I started working in electronic data systems, and there was the first wave of AI came in the mid 80s. And that's when we were doing things like building expert systems. And I managed to create with a colleague of mine who's emerged as my best friend, a very successful implementation of an expert system, an AI-based expert system at EDS, and that motivated me to finish off my college degree. I didn't have my college degree at the time. So then EDS supported me in going to the University of Michigan, where, as you said, I picked up my bachelor's and master's degree, and my advisor at the time was Elliot Soloway. And he was doing research in how programmers program, what are the knowledge structures, what are the ways in which we think when we're programming. And I picked up that research and built programming environments along with educational material, trying to understand how programmers program and trying to build educational material to teach programming more effectively. And that's important because it ignited a lifelong passion for education, developing education materials, etc. Now, the cognitive psychology part was handled through that vein of work. The organizational behavior work came as I was a student at Michigan. As many of us are when we're in college, we don't make a lot of money, or at university, we're not wealthy. And I needed a job. And so the School of Organizational Behavior had published some job postings, and they needed programmers to program software for their organizational behavior research. And I answered those ads, and I became friends and did the research for many groundbreaking aspects of organizational behavior. And I programmed. And in the process of programming for the professors who were in the School of Organizational Behavior, they would teach me about organizational behavior. And I learned many things that at the time were not entirely clear to me. But then when I graduated from university and I became a manager, and I also became more involved in the Agile movement, I had a very deep foundation that has served me very well in terms of what do we mean when we say culture, or what do we mean when we talk about organizational structures, both in the small and in the large? How do we organize effectively? When should we scale? When would we not scale, et cetera? So that's a bit about my history that I think in terms of the early days helped inform who I am today.
Wow. Who would have thought it just reminds me of the word serendipity,
Yeah.
just a happy coincidence, quote unquote. And would there be examples of where, the cognitive psychology part of it also helped you work-wise?
Yeah. A way to think about cognitive psychology and the branch that, I mean, there's psychology is a huge branch of study, right?
Mm.
So cognitive psychology tends to relate to how do we solve problems. And it tends to focus on problem solving where N equals 1. And what I mean by N is the number of participants, and where N is just me as an individual. How do I solve the problems that I'm facing? How do I engage in decompositional activities or refinement or sense making? Organizational behavior deals with N greater than 1. So it can deal with a team of a pair bond, two people solving problems. It can deal with a small team. And we know through many, many, many decades of research that optimal team structures are 8 people or less. I mean, we've known this for, when I say decades, I mean millennia. When you look at military structure and military strategy, we know that people need to be organized into much smaller groups to be effective in problem solving and to move quickly. And then in any organizational structure, there's some notion of a team of teams or team engagement. So cognitive psychology, I think, helps leaders understand individuals and their place within the team. And now we talk about, in the Agile community, we talk about things like, I want T-shaped people. I want people with common skills and their area of expertise. And by organizing enough of the T's, I can create a whole and complete team. I often say, I don't want my database designer designing my user interface, and I don't want my user interface designer optimizing my backend database queries. They're different skills. They're very educated people. They're very sophisticated. But there's also the natural feeling that you and I have about, how do I gain a sense of self? How do I gain a sense of accomplishment, a sense of mastery? Part of gaining a sense of mastery is understanding who you are as a person, what you're good at. In Japanese, they would call that ikigai, right? What are the intersection of, what do I love? What am I good at? What can I make a living at? And what do people need, right? All of these intersections occur on an individual level. And then by understanding that, we can create more effective teams.
Thank you. I've really learned something key here. The relationship between cognitive psychology and organizational behavior. So thanks for breaking it down. Now, can we go quickly to your entrepreneurship? So
Sure.
there must be 3 times you started, 3 times, a company, and you've been successful in that area. What exactly drives you when it comes to, establishing businesses and then knowing when to move on?
Sure. I think it's a combination of reflecting on my childhood and then looking at how that informs someone when they're older. And then opportunities, like you said, serendipity. I think that's a really powerful word that you introduced, and it's a really powerful concept, because sometimes the serendipity is associated with just allowing yourself to pursue something that presents itself. But when I was young, my father died, and my mom had to raise 6 kids on her own. So my dad died when I was 4. My mom raised 6 kids on her own. We were not a wealthy family.
Sorry.
And she was a school teacher. And one of the things that happened was, even though she was a very skilled school teacher, there were budget cuts, and it was a unionized structure. And even though she was ranked very highly, she lost her job because she was low on the hiring totem pole in terms of how the union worked. It was very hard. And that it's, of course, it's always hard to make budget cuts and firing. But I remember when I was very young, making one of those choices, saying, I want to work in a field where we are more oriented towards someone's performance and not oriented on when they were hired or the color of their skin or their gender or other things that to me didn't make sense, that people were making decisions against. And while it's not a perfect field for sure, and we've got lots of improvement, engineering in general, and of course software engineering and software development, spoke to me, or more diverse than in other fields, and I thought that was really good. In terms of being an entrepreneur, that happened serendipitously. I was at the time, before I became an entrepreneur, my last job was working for an Israeli security firm. And years ago, you used to do software anti-piracy and software security through physical dongles. And this was made by a company called Aladdin Knowledge Systems in Israel. And I was the head of engineering and product management for the dongle group. And then I moved into a role of business development for the company. And had a couple of great bosses, but I also learned how to do international management, because I had development teams in Israel. I had development teams in Munich. I had development teams in Portland, Oregon, and in the Bay Area. And this was in the 2000s, right? This is kind of pre-Agile, pre-Salt Lake City, pre-Agile Manifesto, but we were figuring things out and blending and working together. And I thought things were going pretty well, and I enjoyed working for the Israelis and what we were doing. But then we had the first Gulf War, and my wife and I felt that maybe traveling as I was, we weren't sure what was going to happen in the war. I should choose something different. Unfortunately, by that time, we had been through the dot-bomb crisis in Silicon Valley. So it's about 2002 at the time that this was going on. And there really weren't jobs. It was very weird time in Silicon Valley. So in late 2002, I sent an email to a bunch of friends and I said, hey, I'm going to be a consultant who wants to hire me. That was my marketing plan, not very clever. And someone called me and said, hey, I've got a problem, and this is the kind of thing that you can fix. Come consult with us. And I said, great. So I did that. And that started the cleverly named Luke Hohmann Consulting. And but then one thing led to another, and consulting led to opportunities and growth, and I've never looked back. So I think that there is a myth about people who start companies where sometimes you have a plan and you go execute your plan. Sometimes you find a problem and you're solving a problem. Sometimes the problem is your own problem. As in my case, I had 2 small kids and a mortgage, and I needed to provide for my family. And so the best way to do that at the time was to become a consultant. Since then, I have engaged in building companies, sometimes some with more planning, some with more business tools. And of course, as you grow as an entrepreneur, you learn skills that they didn't teach you in school, marketing and pricing and business planning, etc. And so that's kind of how I got started. And now I have kind of come full circle. The second last company I started was Conteneo, and we ended up selling that to Scaled Agile. And that's how I joined the Scaled Agile team. And that was lovely. Moving from a position of being a CEO and being responsible for certain things to being able to be part of a team again, joining the framework team, working with Dean Luffingwell and other members of the framework team to evolve the SAFE framework. That was really lovely. And then of course you get this entrepreneurial itch and you want to do something else. And so I think it comes and goes, and you kind of allow yourself those opportunities.
Wow, yours is an inspiring story. And so what are you now? So you've talked about your first two startups which you sold. What are you doing now?
Yeah, so where I'm at right now is I am the Chief Innovation Officer for a company, Applied Frameworks. Applied Frameworks is a boutique consulting firm that's in a transition to a product company. So if this arm represents my our product revenue, and this arm represents our services revenue, we're expanding our product, and eventually we'll become a product company. And so then the question is, well, what is the product that we're working on? Well, if you look at the Agile community, we've spent a lot of time creating and delivering value. And that's really great. We have had, if you look at the Agile community, we've had amazing support from our business counterparts. They've shoveled literally millions and millions of dollars into Agile training and Agile tooling and Agile transformations. And we've seen a lot of benefit from the Agile community. And when I say Agile, I don't mean SAFe or Scrum or some particular flavor of Agile. I just mean Agile in general. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars to billions of dollars shoved into Agile. And we've created a lot of value for that investment. We've got fewer bugs in our software because we've got so many teams doing XP-driven practices like test-driven development. We've got faster response times because we've learned that we can create smaller releases, and we've created infrastructure that lets us do deployments automatically. Even if you're doing embedded systems, we figured out how to do over-the-air updates. We figured out how to create infrastructure where the cars we're driving are now getting software updates. So we've created for our business leaders lots of value, but there's a problem in that value. Our business leaders now need us to create a profit, and creating value and creating a profit are two different things. And so in the pursuit of value, we have allowed our Agile community to avoid and or atrophy on skills that are vital to product management. And I'm a classically trained product manager. So I've done market segmentation and market valuation and market sizing. I've done pricing, I've done licensing, I've done acquisitions, I've done compliance. But when you look at the traditional definition of a product owner, it's a very small subset of that, especially in certain Agile methods where product owners are team-centric, they're internal-centric. And that's okay. I'm not criticizing that structure, but what's happened is we've got people who no longer know how to price, how to package, how to license products. And we're seeing companies fail, investor money wasted, too much time trying to figure things out, when if we had simply approached the problem with an analysis of not just what am I providing to you in terms of value, but what is that value worth? And how do I structure an exchange where I give you value and you give me money? And that's how businesses survive. And I think what's really interesting about this in terms of Agile is very intimately tied to sustainability. One of the drivers of the Agile movement was way back in the 2000s, we were having very unsustainable practices. People would be working 60, 80 death march weeks of grinding out programmers and grinding out people. And part of the Agile movement was saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't sustainable. And even the notion of what is a sustainable pace is really vital. But a company cannot sustain itself without a profit. And if we don't actually evolve the Agile community from value streams into profit streams, we can't help our businesses survive. And I sometimes ask developers, I say, raise your hand if you're really embracing the idea that your job is to make more money for your company than they pay you. That's called a profit. And because if that's not happening, your company's going to fail.
And they'll be out of a job.
You'll be out of a job. So if you want to be self-interested about your future, help your company be successful. Help them make a profit. And so where I'm at right now is Applied Frameworks has, with my co-author, Jason Tanner, we have published a bold and breakthrough new book called Software Profit Streams. And it's a book that describes how to do pricing and packaging for software-enabled solutions. When we say software-enabled solution, we mean a solution that has software in it somehow. It could be embedded software in your microwave oven. It could be a hosted solution. It could be an API for a payment processor. It could be the software in your car that I talked about earlier. So software-enabled solutions are the foundation, the fabric of our modern lives. As Mark Andreessen said, software is eating the world. Software is going to be in everything. And we need to know how to take the value that we are creating as engineers, as developers, and convert that into pricing and licensing choices that create sustainable profits.
Wow. It's as if you read my mind, because I was going to ask you about your book, The Software Profit Streams, a guide to designing a sustainably profitable business. I also noticed that there is the profit stream canvas that you and your co-author created. So let's assume I am a product manager and let's assume I went down the path of using the business model canvas, and there is the customer value proposition. How do they complement?
How do they all work together?
Yes.
I'm glad you asked that. I think that's a very insightful question. And the reason it's so helpful is because, partly because I'm also friends with Alex Osterwalder. I think he's a wonderful human. He's a dear friend. So let's look at the different elements of the different canvases, if you will, and why we think that this is needed. The business model canvas is kind of how am I structuring my business itself? Like, what are my partners, my suppliers, my relationships, my channel strategy, my brand strategy with respect to my customer segments? And it includes elements of cost, which we're pretty good at. We're pretty good at knowing our costs, and elements of revenue. But the key assumption of revenue, of course, is the selling price and the number of units sold. So, but if you look at the book, Business Model Generation, where the business model canvas comes from, it doesn't actually talk about how to set the price. Is the video game going to be $49? Is it going to be $59 or 49 pounds or 59 pounds? Well, there's a lot of thought that goes into that. Then we have the value proposition canvas, which highlights what are the pains the customer is facing, what are the gains that the customer is facing, what is the jobs to be done of the customer, and how does my solution relate to the jobs, right? How does it help solve the pain the customer is feeling? How does it create gain for the customer? But if you read those books, and both of those books are on my shelf because they're fantastic books, it doesn't talk about pricing. So let's say I create a gain for you. Well, how much can I charge you for the gain I've created? How do I structure that relationship? And how do I know, going back to my business model canvas, that I've got the right market segment, I've got the right investment strategy, I might need to make an investment in the first 1 or 2 releases of my software or my product before I start to make a per unit profit, because I'm evolving. I'm there. It's called the J curve. And the J curve is how much money am I investing before I have to be able to forecast that. I have to be able to model that. But the key input to that is, what is the price? What is the mechanism of packaging that you're using? Is it, for example, is it per user in a SaaS environment, or is it per company in a SaaS environment? Is it a meter? Is it like an API transaction using Stripe or a payment processor, Adyen or Stripe or PayPal, or any of the others that are out there? Or is it an API call where I'm charging a fraction of a penny for an API call? All of those elements have to be put into an economic model, and a forecast has to be created. Now, what's missing about this is that the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas don't give you the insight on how to set the price. They just say there is a price and we're going to use it in our equations. So what we've done is we've said, look, setting the price is itself a complex system. And what I mean by a complex system is that, let's say that I wanted to do an annual license for a new SaaS offering, but I offer that in Europe, and now my solution is influenced or governed by GDPR compliance, where I have data retention and data privacy laws. So my technical architecture that has to enforce the license also has to comply with something in terms of the market in which I'm selling. This complex system needs to be organized. And so what canvases do is, in all of these cases, they let us take a complex system and put some structure behind the choices that we're making in that complex system, so that we can make better choices in terms of system design. I know how I want this to work. I know how I want this to be structured, and therefore I can make system choices so the system is working in a way that benefits the stakeholders, not just me, right? I'm not the only stakeholder. My customers are in this system. My suppliers are in the system. Society itself might be in the system, depending on the system I'm building or the solution I'm building. So the canvases enable us to make system level choices that are hopefully more effective in achieving our goals. And like I said, the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas are fantastic, highly recommended, but they don't cover pricing. So we needed something to cover the actual pricing and packaging and licensing.
Wow, that's awesome. So it's really more about taking a deeper dive into thoughtfully and structurally, if I may use that word, assessing the pricing. And would you say that in doing this, there would be some elements of, testing and getting feedback from actual customers to know what price point would make sense?
Okay. Yeah, there's a number of ways in which customer engagement or customer testing is involved. The very first step that we advocate is a customer benefit analysis, which is, what are the actual benefits you're creating and how are your customers experiencing those benefits? Those experiences are both tangible and intangible. And that's another one of the challenges that we face in the Agile community. In general, the Agile community spends a little bit more time on tangible or functional value than intangible value. So we, in terms of, if I were to look at it in terms of a computer, we used to say speeds and feeds. How fast is the processor? How fast is the network? How much storage is on my disk space? Those are all functional elements. Over time, as our computers have become plenty fast or plenty storage-wise for most of our personal computing needs, we see elements of design come into play, elements of usability, elements of brand. And we see this in other areas. Cars have improved in quality so much that many of us the durability of the car is no longer a significant attribute because all cars are pretty durable. They're pretty good. They're pretty well made. So now we look at brand, we look at style, we look at aesthetics. We look at even paying more for a car that aligns with our values in terms of the environment. I want to get an EV. Why? Because I want to be more environmentally conscious. That's a value driven, that's an intangible factor. And so our first step starts with customer benefit analysis, looking at both functional or tangible value and intangible value. And you can't do that, as you can imagine, you can't do that without having customer interaction and awareness with your stakeholders and your customers. And that also feeds throughout the whole pricing process. Eventually, you're going to put your product in a market, and that's a form itself of market research. Did customers buy? And if they didn't buy, why did they not buy? Is it poorly packaged or is it poorly priced? These are all elements that involve customers throughout the process.
If I may, I know we've been on the topic of your latest book, Software Profit Streams. I'm just wondering, because I can't help but try to connect the dots, and I'm wondering if there might be a connection to one of your books, Innovation Games, Creating Breakthrough Products Through Collaborative Play. Something like, buy a feature in your book. That kind of came to mind. Could there be a way of using that as part of the engagement with customers in setting a pricing strategy? I may be wrong. I'm just asking a question.
Oh, no, I think you're making a great connection. There's two forms of relationship that Innovation Games and the Innovation Games book have with software profit streams. One is, as you correctly noted, just the basics of market research. Where do people have pains or gains and what it might be worth. That work is also included in Alex Osterwalder's books, Value Proposition Design. For example, when I'm doing value proposition design and I'm trying to figure out the customer pains, you can use the Innovation Game Speedboat. And when I want to figure out the gains, I can use the Innovation Game Product Box. Similarly, when I'm figuring out pricing and licensing, a way, and it's a very astute idea, a way to understand price points of individual features is to do certain kinds of market research. One form of market research you can do is buy a feature, which gives a gauge of what people are willing or might be willing to pay for a feature. It can be a little tricky because the normal construction of buy a feature is based on cost. However, your insight is correct. You can extend buy a feature such that you're testing value as opposed to cost and seeing if you take a feature that costs X, but inflate that cost by Y in a buy a feature game, if people still buy it, it's a strong signal strength that first they want it, and second, it may be a feature that you can, when delivered, would motivate you to raise the price of your offering and create a better profit for your company.
Okay, well, thank you. I wasn't sure if I was on the right.
It's a great connection.
Well, thanks again. I mean, it's not original. I'm just piggybacking on your ideas. If you don't mind, let's shift gears a bit, because I know that, or I'm aware that whilst you were with Scaled Agile Incorporated, you played a key part in developing some of the courses, like the product POPM, and I think the lead portfolio management. And there was the concept about participatory budgeting. Can we talk about that, please?
Absolutely. In February of 2018, I started working with the framework team, and in December of 2018, we talked about the possibility of what an acquisition might look like and the benefits it would create, which would be many. That closed in May of 2019. And in that time frame, we were working on SAFe 5.0. And so there were a couple of areas in which I was able to make some contributions. One was in agile product delivery competency. The other was in lean portfolio management. I had a significant hand in restructuring or adding the POPM, APM, and LPM courses. adding things like solutions by horizons to SAFE, taking the existing content on guardrails, expanding it a little bit, and of course, adding participatory budgeting, which is just a huge passion of mine. I've done participatory budgeting now for 20 years. I've helped organizations make more than $5 billion of investment spending choices at all levels of companies, myself and my colleagues at Applied Frameworks. And it just is a better way to make a shared decision. If you think about one of the examples I use about participatory budgeting is my preferred form of fitness is I'm a runner. And so, and my wife is also a fit person. So if she goes and buys a new pair of shoes or trainers, and I go and buy a new pair of trainers, we don't care because it's a small purchase, it's frequently made, and it's within the pattern of our normal behavior. However, if I were to go out and buy a new car without involving her, that feels different, right? It's a significant purchase. It requires budgeting and care. And is this car going to meet our needs? Our kids are older than your kids, so we have different needs and different requirements. And so I would be losing trust in my pair bond with my wife if I made a substantial purchase without her involvement. Well, corporations work the same way because we're still people. So if I'm funding a value stream, I'm funding the consistent and reliable flow of valuable items. That's what value stream funding is supposed to do. However, if there is a significant investment to be made, even if the value stream can afford it, it should be introduced to the portfolio for no other reason than the social structure of healthy organizations says that we do better when we're talking about these things, that we don't go off on our own and make significant decisions without the input of others. That lowers transparency, that lowers trust. So I am a huge advocate of participatory budgeting. I'm very happy that it's included in SAFE as a recommended practice, both for market research and by a feature in APM, but also more significantly, if you will, at the portfolio level for making investment decisions. And I'm really excited to share that we've just published an article a few weeks ago about participatory budgeting and what's called the color of money. And the color of money is sometimes when you have constraints on how you can spend money. And an example of a constraint is, let's say that a government raised taxes to improve transportation infrastructure. Well, the money that they took in is constrained in a certain way. You can't spend it, for example, on education. And so we have to show how participatory budgeting can be adapted to have relationships between items, like this item requires this item as a precedent, or the color of money constraints of funding items. But I'm a big believer. We just published that article, and you can get that at the Scaled Agile website. Okay. I'm a big believer in the social power of making these financial decisions and the benefits that accrue to people and organizations when they collaborate in this manner.
So, thanks for going into that, Luke. So would there be, in your experience, any type of organization that's participatory? It's not a leading question, it's just genuine.
Sure.
There are typically outliers, and I'm wondering, in your experience and in your opinion, if there would be organizations that it might not work for.
Surprisingly, no, but I want to add a few qualifications to the effective design of a participatory budgeting session. When people hear participatory budgeting, there's different ways that you would apply participatory budgeting in the public and private sector. So I've done citywide participatory budgeting in cities. And if you're a citizen of a city and you meet the qualifications for voting within that jurisdiction, in the United States, it's typically that you're 18 years old. In some places you have to be a little older, in some places you might have other qualifications, but if you're qualified to participate as a citizen in democratic processes, then you should be able to participate in participatory budgeting sessions that are associated with things like how do we spend taxes or how do we make certain investments. In corporations, it's not quite the same way. Just because you work at a company doesn't mean you should be included in portfolio management decisions that affect the entire company. You may not have the background, you may not have the training, you may be what my friends sometimes call a fresher. So I do a lot of work overseas. So freshers, they just may not have the experience to participate. So one thing that we look at in participatory budgeting and SAFE is who should be involved in the sessions. And that doesn't mean that every single employee should always be included, because their background may be a technical topic and maybe they don't have the right technical background. So we work a little bit harder in corporations to make sure the right people are there. Now, of course, we if we're going to make a mistake, we tend to make this mistake of including more people than excluding, partly because in SAFE participatory budgeting, it's a group of people who are making a decision, not a one person, one vote. And that's really profoundly important, because in a corporation, just like in a pair bond, your opinion matters to me. I want to know what you're thinking. If I'm looking, and I'll use SAFE terminology, if I'm looking at 3 epics that could advance our portfolio, and I'm a little unsure about 2 of those epics, like one of those epics, I'm like, yeah, this is a really good thing. I know a little bit about it. This matters. I'm going to fund this. But the other 2 I'm not so sure about. Well, there's no way I can learn through reading alone what the opinions of other people are. Because again, there's these intangible factors. There's these elements that may not be included in an ROI analysis. It's kind of hard to talk about brand in an ROI analysis. We can, but it's hard. So I want to listen to how other people are talking about things. And through that, I can go, yeah, I can see the value. I didn't see it before. I'm going to join you in funding this. So that's among the ways in which participatory budgeting is a little different within the private sector and the public sector and within a company. The only other element that I would add is that participatory budgeting gives people the permission to stop funding items that are no longer likely to meet the investment or objectives of the company, or to change minds. And so one of the, again, this is a bit of an overhang in the Agile community. Agile teams are optimized for doing things that are small, things that can fit within a 2 or 3 week sprint. That's great. No criticism there. But our customers and our stakeholders want big things that move the market needle. And the big things that move the market needle don't get done in 2 or 3 weeks in general. And they rarely, they require multiple teams working multiple weeks to create a really profoundly new, important thing. And so what happens, though, is that we need to make, in a sense, funding commitments for these big things, but we also have to have a way to change our mind. And so traditional funding processes, they let us make this big commitment, but they're not good at letting us change our mind, meaning they're not agile. Participatory budgeting gives us the best of both worlds. I can sit at the table with you and with our colleagues. We can commit to funding something that's big, but 6 months later, which is the recommended cadence from SAFE, I can come back to that table and reassess. And we can all look at each other, because you know those moments, right? You've had that experience in business. You're like looking around the table and you're like, yeah, this isn't working. And then in traditional funding, we keep funding what's not working because there's no built-in mechanism to easily change it. But in SAFE participatory budgeting, you and I can sit at the table and we can look at each other with our colleagues and say, yeah, you know, that initiative just it's not working. Well, let's change our mind. Okay, what is the new thing that we can fund? What is the new epic? And that permission is so powerful within a corporation.
And thanks for sharing that. And whilst you were speaking, because again, me trying to connect the dots, I'm thinking for an organization that has adopted SAFe or is trying to scale agility, because like you mentioned, agile teams are optimized to iteratively develop or deliver, small chunks over time,
Yeah.
usually 2 to 3 weeks. But like you said, there is a longer time horizon spanning months, even years into the future, sometimes for those worthwhile, meaty things to be delivered that moves the strategic needle, if I may use that buzzword. So let's say at that lean portfolio level, we're looking at epics, right?
Yes.
And participatory budgeting, we are looking at initiatives on an epic to epic basis per se. Where would the lean startup cycle come in here? So is it that participatory budgeting could be a mechanism that is used for assessing, okay, this is the MVP features that have been developed and all that, the leading indicators we've gotten, that's presented to the group, and on that basis we make that pivot or persevere or stop decision. Would that
Not
fit
quite.
in? Okay.
Yeah, so let's. I mean, you're close, but let me make just a few turns, and then it'll click better.
Okay.
First, let's acknowledge that the SAFe approach to the lean startup cycle is not the Eric Ries approach. There are some differences.
Yeah.
But let's separate how I fund something from how I evaluate something. So if I'm going to engage in the SAFe lean startup cycle, part of that engagement is to fund an MVP, which is going to prove or disprove a given hypothesis. So that's an expenditure of money. Now, if you think about the expenditure of money, there's minimally 2 steps in this process. There's spending enough money to conduct the experiments, and if those experiments are true, making another commitment to spend money again that I want to spend it. Now, the reason this is important is, let's say I had 3 experiments running in parallel, and I'm going to use easy round numbers for a large corporation. Let's say I want to run 3 experiments in parallel, and each experiment costs me £1 million. Okay, so now let's say that the commercialization of each of those is an additional amount of money. So the portfolio team sits around the table and says, we have the money, we're going to fund all 3. Okay, great. Well, it's an unlikely circumstance, but let's say all 3 are successful. Well, this is like a venture capitalist. And I have a talk that I give that relates the funding cycle of a venture capitalist to the funding cycle of an LPM team. While it's unlikely, you could have all 3 become successful. And this is what I call an oversubscribed portfolio. I've got 3 great initiatives, but I can still only fund 1 or 2 of them. I still have to make the choice. Now, of course, I'm going to look at my economics. Let's say out of the 3 initiatives that were successfully proven through their hypothesis, let's say one of them is just clearly not as economically attractive for whatever reason. Okay, we get rid of that one. Now I've got 2. And if I can only fund one of them, and the ROI, the hard ROI is roughly the same, that's when participatory budgeting really shines, because we can have those leaders come back into the room and they can say, which choice do we want to make now? So the evaluative aspect of the MVP is the leading indicators and the results of the proving or disproving of the hypotheses. We separate that from the funding choices, which is where participatory budgeting and LPM kick in.
So you've separated the, proving or disproving the hypothesis of the feature, I mean, some of the features that will probably make up an epic, and you're saying the funding, the decision to fund the epic in the first place is a different conversation. And you've likened it to venture capital funding rounds. Where do they connect? Because if they're separate, what's the connecting thread between the
Well, the
two?
connective thread is the portfolio process, right?
Okay.
The actual process is the mechanism where I'm connecting these things.
Okay, no, thanks for the portfolio process. But there is something you mentioned, ROI, return on investment. And
Yes.
sometimes when you're developing new products, you don't know, you have assumptions,
Sure.
and any ROI, sorry to put it this way, but you're really plucking figures from the air, you're modeling, but there is no certainty because you could hit the mark or you could go way off
That's
the
right.
mark. And so where does that innovation accounting come into place, especially if it's a product that's yet to make contact with, real life users, the customers?
Well, let's go back to something you said earlier. And what you talked about earlier about was the relationship that you have in market research and customer interaction. And making a forecast, let's go ahead and look at the notion of building a new product within a company. And this is, again, where the Agile community sometimes doesn't want to look at numbers or quote unquote get dirty, but we have to. Because if I'm going to look at building a new idea or taking a new idea into a product, I have to have a forecast of its viability. Is it economically viable? Is it a good choice? So innovation accounting is a way to look at certain data, but before I'm going to steal a quote from one of my friends, Jeff Patton. The most expensive way to figure this out is to actually build the product. So what can I do that's less expensive than building the product itself? I can still do market research, but maybe I wouldn't do an innovation game. Maybe I do a formal survey and I use a price point testing mechanism like Van Westendorp price point analysis, which is a series of questions that you ask to triangulate on acceptable price ranges. I can do competitive benchmarking for similar products and services. What are people offering right now in the market? Now that again, if the product is completely novel, doing competitive benchmarking can be really hard. Like right now, there's so many people doing streaming that we look at the competitive market. But when Netflix first offered streaming, and it was the first one, their best approach was what we call reference pricing, which is I have a reference price for how much I pay for my DVDs that I'm getting in the mail. I'm going to base my streaming service kind of on the reference pricing of entertainment, although that's not entirely clear that that was the best way to go, because you could also base the reference price on what you're paying for a movie ticket and how many, but then you look at consumption, right? Because movie tickets are expensive. So I only go to a movie maybe once every other month, whereas streaming is cheap. And so I can change my demand curve by lowering my price. But this is why it's such a hard science, is because we have this notion of these swirling factors. Getting specifically back to your question about the price point, I do have to do some market research before I go into the market to get some forecasting and some confidence, and research gives me more confidence. And of course, once I'm in the market, I'll know how effective my research matched the market reality. Maybe my research was misleading. And of course, there's some skill in designing research, as you know, to get answers that have high quality signal strength.
Thanks for clarifying. No, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I'm not, it's kind of like a forecast saying like there's a group of agile people who will say like you shouldn't make forecasts. Well, I don't understand that, because that's like saying and people will say, well, I can't predict the future. Well, okay, I can't predict when I'm going to retire, but I'm planning to retire. Like, I don't know the date of my exact retirement, but my wife and I are planning our retirement, and we're saving. We're making certain investment choices for our future because we expect to have a future together. Now, our kids are older than yours. My kids are now in university, and so we're closer to retirement. So what I dislike about the Agile community is people will sometimes say, well, I don't know the certainty of the event, therefore I can't plan for it. But that's really daft, because there are many places in, like, you may not, for the listeners, her daughter is a little younger than my kids, but they will be going to university one day. And depending on where they go, that's a financial choice. So you could say, well, I don't know when she's going to university, and I can't predict what university is she's going to go to, therefore I'm not going to save any money. Really? That doesn't make no sense. So I really get very upset when you have people in the Agile community will say things like road mapping or forecasting is not Agile. It's entirely Agile. How you treat it is Agile or not Agile. Like when my child comes up to me and says, hey, you know about that going to university thing? I was thinking of taking a gap year. Okay, wait a minute. That's a change. That doesn't mean no. It means you're laughing, right? But that's a change. And so we respond to change, but we still have a plan.
It makes sense. So the reason, and I completely resonate with everything you said. The reason I raise that ROI and it not being known is that in some situations, people might be tempted to use it to game the budget allocation decision-making process by inflating. That's why I said, you could pluck the ROI, let's just get
okay, let's talk about that. I'm really glad we actually addressed this in our recent paper, but I'll give you my personal experience. You are vastly more likely to get bad behavior on ROI analysis when you do not do participatory budgeting, because there's no social construct to prevent bad behavior. If I'm sitting down at a table, and let's virtual or physical, it doesn't matter, but let's take a perfect optimum size for a participatory budgeting group, 6 people. Let's say I'm a director or a senior director in a company, and I'm sitting at a table and there's another senior director who's a peer. Maybe there's a VP, maybe there's a person from engineering, maybe there's a person from sales, and we've got this mix of people, and I'm sitting at that table. I am not incented to come in with an inflated ROI, because those people are really intelligent, and given enough time, they're not going to support my initiative because I'm fibbing. I'm lying. And I have a phrase for this. It's when ROI becomes ROI that it's dangerous. And so, right. And so when I'm sitting at that table, what we find consistently, and one of the clients that we did a fair amount of participatory budgeting for years ago was Cisco. What we found was the leaders at Cisco were creating tighter, more believable, and more defensible economic projections, precisely because they knew that they were going to be sitting with their peers. And it didn't matter, like it can go both ways. Sometimes people will overestimate the ROI, or they underestimate the cost. Same outcome, right? I'm going to overestimate the benefit, or I'm going to, and people would be like, yeah, I don't think you can build that product with 3 teams. You're going to need 5 or 6 teams. And people go, oh no, I can get it done with 20 people. Yeah, I don't think so, because 2 years ago we built this product. It's very similar, and we thought we could get it done with 20 people, and we couldn't. We really needed a bigger group. So you see the social construct creating a more believable set of results, because people come to the participatory budgeting session knowing that their peers are in the room. And of course, we think we're smart, so our peers are as smart as we are. we're all smart people. And therefore, the social construct of participatory budgeting quite literally creates a better input, which creates a better output.
That makes sense, definitely. No, thanks for sharing. I found that very, very insightful and something I can easily apply. I mean, the reasoning behind it, the social pressure, quote unquote, knowing that you're not just going to put the paper forward, but you'd have to defend it in a credible, believable way. Makes sense. So just to wrap up now, what books have you found yourself recommending to people the most, and why?
Oh, it's so funny. I get yelled at by my wife for how many books I buy. She'll be like, it's Amazon again, another book. There's this thing called a library. And
You should do participatory budgeting for your books then. Sounds like, sorry.
no, I don't. I'd lose. Gosh, I love so many books. So there's a few books that I consider to be my go-to references and my go-to classics. But I also recommend that people reread books. And sometimes I recommend rereading books is because you're a different person, and as you age and as you grow and you see things differently. And in fact, I'm right now rereading, and of course it goes faster, but I'm rereading the original XP Explained by Kent Beck. A fantastic book. I just finished reading a few new books, but let me give you a couple of classics that I think everyone in our field should read and why they should read them. I think everyone should read The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks, because he really covers some very profound truths that haven't changed. Things like Brooks' Law, which is adding programmers to a late project makes it later. He talks about the structure of teams and how to scale before scaling was big and important and cool. He talks about communication and conceptual integrity and the role of the architect. The other book that I'm going to give, which I hope is different than any book that anyone has ever given you, because it's one of my absolute favorite books, and I give them away. It's a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And comics or graphic novels are an important medium for communication. And when we talk about storytelling and we talk about how to frame information and how to present information, understanding comics is profoundly insightful in terms of how to present, share, show information. A lot of times I think we make things harder than they should be. So when I'm working with executives and some of the clients that I work with personally, when we talk about our epics, we actually will tell stories about the hero's journey, and we actually hire comic book artists to help the executives tell their story in a comic form or in a graphic novel form. So I absolutely love Understanding Comics. I think that that's really a profound book. Of course, you mentioned Alex Osterwalder's books, Business Model Generation, Business Model Canvas. Those are fantastic books for product managers. I also, just looking at my own bookshelf, of course, innovation games and of course, software profit streams, because we have to figure out how to create sustainability. But in reality, there's so many books that we love and that we share and that we grow together when we're sharing books. And I'll add one thing. Please don't only limit your books to technical books. We're humans too. This weekend, when I mean recent, I mean literally this weekend, I was visiting one of my kids in Vermont, all the way across the country. And so on the plane ride, I finished two books. One was a very profound and deeply written book called Pony Boy. And then another one was the book Lessons in Chemistry.
Okay.
Which is a new book that's out. And it was a super fun, light read. Some interesting lessons, of course, because there's always lessons in books. And now if it's okay, if I'm not
Please.
overstepping my bounds, what would be a book that you'd like me to read? I love to add books to my list.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know. You are the first guest ever who's twisted this on me, but I tend to read multiple books at a time.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. So, and I kind of switch, maybe put some on my bedside, and there's some on my Kindle and in the car, just depending. So I'm reading multiple books at a time. But based on what you've said, and based on the one that comes to mind is the new book by Oprah Winfrey, and it's titled "What Happened to You? Understanding Trauma." Because like you said, it's not just about reading technical books, and we're human beings, and we find out that people behave probably sometimes in ways that are different to us. And it's not about saying what's wrong with you, because there is a story that we might not have been privy to, in terms of their childhood, how they grew up, which affected their worldview and how they are acting. So things don't just suddenly happen. The question that we have been asked, and we sometimes ask of people, for me, I'm reading it from a parent's perspective, because I understand that even more so that my actions, my choices, they play a huge, part in shaping my children. Right. So it's not saying what's wrong with you. You say, what's happened to you, and it traces back to, based on research, because she wrote it with a renowned psychologist. I don't know his field, but a renowned psychologist. So neuroscience-based psychological research on human beings, attachment theory and all that, just showing how early childhood experiences, even as early as maybe a few months old, tend to affect people well into adulthood. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you so much. That's a gift. And I appreciate that.
You're the first person to ask me, so my pleasure. So what final words, before we go to the final words, where can the audience find you? Because you have a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience, and I am sure that people would want to say, get in touch with you. So how can they do this, please?
Yeah, well, they can get me on LinkedIn, and they can find me at Applied Frameworks. I tell you, I teach classes that are known to be very profound, because we always reserve, myself and the instructors at Applied Frameworks, we are very strong commitments to reserving class time for what we call the parking lot, or the Ask Me Anything question, which are many times after I've covered the core material in the class, having the opportunity to really frame how to apply something is really important. And so I would definitely encourage people to take one of my classes, because you'll not get the material, you'll get the reasons behind the material, which means you can apply it, but you'll also be able to ask us questions. And our commitment as a company is, you can ask us anything, and if we don't know the answer, we'll help you find it. We'll help you find the expert or the person that you need to talk to help you out and be successful. And then I think in terms of final words, I will simply ask people to remember that we get to work in the most amazing field, building things for other people, and it's joyful work. And one of my phrases is, if you're not doing Agile, if you're not having fun at work, there's something really wrong. There's something missing. Yeah, we need to retrospect, and we need to improve, and we need to reflect, and all those important things. Absolutely. But we should allow ourselves to experience the joy of serving others and being of service and building things that matter.
I love the concept of joyful agile, and getting joy in building things that matter, serving people. may I add also working together with
Yes.
amazing people. Yes. And for me, it's been a joyful conversation with you, Luke. I really appreciate your making the time. I am definitely richer and more enlightened as a result of this conversation. So thank you so much once more for
Thank
being
you so
on.
much for having me here. Thank you everyone for listening with us.
Thanks. That's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, do subscribe at www.agileinnovationleaders.com. That's agileinnovationleaders.com, or your favorite podcast provider. Also share with friends and do leave a review on iTunes. This would help others find this show. I'd also love to hear from you, so please drop me an email at ola@agileinnovationleaders.com. Take care and God bless.